The silence was obscene. Rylan had felt the metal of the dampener coils shudder in his grip, not from the expected final torque, but from a rapid systemic collapse of all ambient vibration. Down here, deep in the service bay beneath the admiral's shuttle, the usual constant thrum of the Fleet Command Juno Class was a physical presence, a sound you felt in your teeth. Now, that presence was violently subtracted. It left a painful, aching vacuum in his inner ear. Ryland's comm bead, usually buzzing with traffic from the propulsion deck, went dead with a high-pitched, almost ultrasonic whine that lasted perhaps half a second, but seemed to stretch into an eternity of digital death. He stared at the newly locked dampener. It was perfectly aligned, secured precisely where it needed to be. His job was done, but the cost was everything else. He was just a Level 3 acoustic NCO, a grease monkey finalizing archaic second expansion hardware on the Admiral's personal transport, the Vespide Tarpoise. The old coils demanded verbal calibration for final torque sequencing, a ridiculous analog requirement. But policy was policy. Rylan had transmitted the simple confirmation, module green active, and the entire flagship had gone mute. A terrible cold certainty settled in his stomach, heavier than the torque wrench he still held. It wasn't a system failure. It was a lock, a massive system-wide imposition. He knew the resonance frequency of the human voice was complex, often non-standard, but his own was particularly anomalous, a quirk of genetics he had been careful to suppress or mask for years. He had just inadvertently broadcast a signal, not a maintenance code, but a key. On the bridge, Admiral Kalia would be staring at primary displays that had inverted to a terrifying absolute black. All external comms were dead. The internal network would be reduced to emergency, hardwired conduits only. He was the cause. He, Rylan, whose daily existence was defined by the low ceiling of his Level 3 ranking, had just achieved what no external enemy had managed in 50 years of active service. He had completely isolated the Fleet Command vessel. His hands, stained with hydro-lube, felt suddenly clumsy. He should initiate local bay protocol for comm failure, but his gut screamed against it. This was no localized failure. This was Protocol 73 Delta. He recognized the signature of the lock, that distinct, brittle quality of the absolute silence, because 73 Delta was a ghost in the machine, a historical function from the pre-collapse era, designed centuries ago when biometric acoustic keys were deemed the ultimate security measure. The design specifications were still buried deep in the fleet archives, accessible only to those cursed souls like Level 3 technicians, forced to maintain ancient, unupgraded components. The system had interpreted his specific vocal harmonic profile, completely non-standard and unknown to command records, as the original high-priority activation frequency. His voice was the historical override. The injustice of it flared hot and sharp, overwhelming the cold fear. His specific frequency was a natural anomaly, a quirk inherited from people command preferred to forget existed. He had spent 10 years flattening that identity, filing himself down to a compliant, non-threatening Level 3 worker. Precisely so, he would never draw attention. And now, a simple, mandatory confirmation had betrayed him, turning his physical reality into a security threat. He heard a metallic scraping sound from the docking hatch above the Vespide Da, the sound traveling through the structure itself, bypassing the dead comms. Kalia was coming. Ryland dropped the torque a wrench. The clang echoed unnaturally loud in the dead air of the service bay. He moved with a sudden, devastating efficiency that belonged neither to a Level 3 mechanic nor to the terrified man he was supposed to be. His internal conflict was brutal. Move fast and solve the problem, or move slowly and maintain the facade of incompetence that was his only protection. Solving it meant confirming that he knew exactly what 73 Delta was, and by extension, who he was. He snatched up a small, archaic diagnostic tool, a second expansion frequency analyzer, something most command staff would mistake for a simple pry bar, and slammed it against the dampener casing. He needed to find the passive feedback loop. If the lock was truly 73 Delta, it didn't just kill comms, it hardened the hull plating and rerouted all life support to emergency deep cycle, assuming external breach and hostile boarding. The bridge crew was sealed inside a vault designed for deep history, running on life support calculated for a 3-day siege. He didn't have 3 days. Kalia's mission was critical: retrieval of pre-collapse archival matrices. If they failed to rendezvous with the data carrier in 4 hours, the entire fleet timeline collapsed. A flicker of light caught his eye, not the emergency bay lighting, but the single, narrow optical feed leading from the shuttle's primary docking observation lens. It was a secondary line, non-networked, designed for visual confirmation only. Ryland realized Kalia wasn't relying on sound. She was relying on sight. She was watching him. The scraping sound intensified. The manual hatch lock was engaging. Admiral Kalia was exiting the shuttle bay and entering the maintenance tunnel, a violation of almost every protocol, driven by the absolute silence he had created. He held the analyzer against the metallic casing, listening not to sound, but to the faint, residual magnetic fields vibrating through the ancient coils. The magnetic signature of 73 Delta was unique, a repeating, complex fractal pattern designed to be unbreakable by modern algorithms. Because modern systems couldn't even parse its structure, it was security through technological incompatibility. Educational element in action. Ryland knew that the very thing that made modern encryption strong, its computational complexity, made it useless against systems from a pre-digital age. The old acoustic locks operated on pure physics, on the shape of a sound wave, treating the voice as a complex physical fingerprint, not a series of data points. Modern firewalls were useless against a simple physical key. He muttered to himself, the words barely audible. The vocal harmonic must be inverted through a frequency modulator set to the 88-point tertiary scale, then rebroadcast at half power to simulate atmospheric scatter. This was knowledge far above his pay grade, knowledge earned not in a prestigious academy, but in desperate hours maintaining derelict ships in forgotten yards, places where Level 3 technicians scavenged for survival. He began the rapid disassembly of his diagnostic tool, pulling wires and relays from the casing. His movements were fluid, precise, and utterly devoid of the nervous haste expected of a frightened Level 3 NCO. He was working to bypass a security system designed to survive galactic collapse, and he looked like a concert pianist adjusting a delicate instrument. A voice, sharp and compressed through the structural intercom that had just barely remained functional, a redundant ancient speaker system, cut through the structural silence. It was Kalia. "NCO Ryland," the voice commanded, tight with controlled fury. "Report condition, now." Ryland froze. the wires dangling between his thumb and forefinger, he had to speak. He had to lie. He had to explain the inexplicable failure without revealing that his very identity was the accidental weapon. He swallowed, tasting the metallic fear on his tongue. He opened his mouth, prepared to recite the prepared script for a minor sensor array short. "Admiral," he began, and the moment his voice carried across the compromised hull, Kalia cut him off. "Do not attempt to explain the failure, Rylan. I want you to look at the observation lens. Now." Rylan slowly raised his head, meeting the cold stare of the small black optic. He could feel her gaze on him, calculating, analytical. He saw a brief, sharp flash of light. The camera was focusing, capturing his image, logging his face into the emergency bridge systems. "That voice," Kalia's voice hissed over the redundant speaker, losing its composure for the first time. "I recognize that signature, Rylan. Protocol 73 Delta requires an archaic biometric key. Your profile is anomalous, completely non-standard." The Admiral paused, the sound of her own ragged breathing just audible. "Tell me, technician," she demanded, the fury replaced by a terrible dawning suspicion. "Where did a Level 3 acoustic NCO learn the exact harmonic signature needed to disable a fleet command vessel?" Rylan looked at the diagnostic tool, now a crude frequency modulator in his skilled hands. His voice, once a weakness, was the key to this ancient vault. But the system had only recognized the signature. It had not identified the man. Kalia's recognition meant more than an operational error. It meant exposure. He decided then. He would not lie about the technical problem. He would lie about the solution. He lowered his gaze, his eyes fixed on the wires. "Admiral, I have identified the lock source. It's a legacy acoustic anomaly tied to the dampener coils," he stated, keeping his tone measured, devoid of any emotional tell. He was playing the competent, focused mechanic. "And the solution?" Kalia pressed. Rylan pressed two wires together, creating a spark that smelled faintly of ozone. The bridge systems were dead, but Rylan was alive. He had the key, and Kalia was trapped in the vault he had sealed. He looked back up at the unblinking eye of the camera, his composure absolute. "I can open it, Admiral," Rylan replied, his voice clean and steady. "But for that specific system, activation is a manual override. The only way to broadcast the inverse key is to use the original transmitter. You will have to let me into the bridge. You will have to physically touch the mechanism." Rylan heard a sharp, drawn breath from the structural speaker. Kalia knew the immense risk of allowing an unknown low-level technician into the highest security area during a hard lock. "Rylan," she said, her voice dangerously quiet, "before I grant that access, I need to know why your Level 3 profile carries the spectral signature of a pre-collapse high command operative." The small metallic eye of the camera focused again. Rylan held her gaze, showing neither panic nor subservience. He showed only the cold, unyielding competence of a man who suddenly realized that the biggest flaw in integrated security infrastructure wasn't the technology, but the assumptions about who was allowed to touch it. He was a ghost in the machine, and he had just used his own voice to declare himself operational. He held the silence, letting the tension build, letting Kalia feel the suffocating pressure of the technological cage he had unknowingly built around her. Then, slowly, Rylan smiled. It was not a smile of malice, but one of deep, weary recognition. "I didn't choose the frequency, Admiral," Ryland said. "The frequency chose me." Admiral Kalia did not immediately respond. The charged statement, "The frequency chose me," hung in the dead air of the service bay, amplified only by the faint, stressed groan of the ship's structure reacting to the hardlock. Ryland felt the sudden crushing weight of his gamble. He had just traded the safety of invisibility for a position of undeniable threat, placing his life and 10 years of meticulous self-erasure into Kalia's hands. The structural speaker crackled once, a violent burst of static that smelled faintly of ozone overload, before Kalia's voice returned, razor-sharp and absolutely devoid of the earlier fear. "You are suggesting, NCO Ryland, that the only way to disable a historical security protocol designed to prevent high-level infiltration is to allow an unknown operator into the heart of Fleet Command." "I am suggesting, Admiral," Ryland corrected, holding the optic lens's gaze, "that the system requires its original transmission hardware, which is housed on the bridge. My inverted harmonic is the key, but the shuttle bay diagnostic unit lacks the necessary power output to break the structural loop. I need the primary conduit." "You have 4 minutes before the scheduled data retrieval window closes entirely," she stated, ignoring his technical explanation. This wasn't a negotiation of hardware. It was a negotiation of necessity. "If you are lying, Ryland, your immediate execution will be the least of your concerns. We are hard locked into an archaic siege mode. Life support is nominal, but we are a stationary target. Commander Var is calculating the external risk now." Ryland recognized the name Var, Chief Tactical Officer, known for his relentless adherence to standard protocol and his personal distaste for non-academy personnel. Kalia was introducing the antagonist force, making the stakes clear. If Ryland failed, Var would ensure the protocol was swift and severe. "I need access to the inner security corridor, Admiral," Ryland pressed, ignoring the implied threat. He didn't fear death so much as he feared the forced return to anonymity, the final, systemized erasure of his skill. Proving his low-level rank was the only thing command ever truly saw. A heavy electronic clunk vibrated through the floor plates. It was the sound of the maintenance airlock releasing. "You have 20 seconds to reach the first airlock, Ryland," Kalia commanded. "The hatch will seal behind you. Commander Var will guide you via the emergency conduit, visually, until you reach the bridge access hatch. At no point are you permitted to deviate from the direct route." Ryland moved. He grabbed the disassembled frequency modulator, now a delicate cluster of wires and salvaged relays, and tucked it securely into his belt pouch. He vaulted over the support strut of the Vespidade shuttle, his movements quiet, efficient, and deeply habituated to working in confined, pressurized spaces. He felt the ship's low-frequency emergency cycle vibrating beneath his worn boots, a slow, deep pulse that felt like a dying heartbeat. He reached the airlock hatch and stepped across the threshold just as the first automated defense piston slammed into place behind him, sealing the service bay. He was now officially outside his designated workspace and inside the high-security perimeter. The air in the corridor was noticeably colder, thinner, a direct consequence of 73 Delta rationing oxygen for the 3-day siege assumption. "NCO Ryland," a new voice cut in through the faint structural speaker, tighter, higher frequency laced with pure distrust. It was Commander Var. Extend your hands, palms facing the observation lens. Now, your biometrics are currently flagging as anomaly high risk, origin unknown. Any sudden movement will result in structural depressurization of your current zone. Rylan complied, holding his hydrolube-stained hands up to the embedded camera lens. He felt a moment of raw, visceral vulnerability. These hands, which knew the intimate language of decaying metal and obsolete code, were now being scanned not for competence, but for lineage. A thought flared, quick and painful, a sensory flashback to the forgotten shipyards. The smell of welding smoke and cold vacuum. 3 years ago, he had used this same unique harmonic to recalibrate a derelict long-range sensor array that had been classified as unsalvageable. He saved the equipment, but the system had tagged his presence, his voice, as an unauthorized genetic anomaly, triggering the immediate digital erasure of the entire yard's maintenance log. They didn't reward the save. They destroyed the evidence of his existence. He realized then that for some, the solution was less important than the origin of the solver. He was the cure that poisoned the official record. That was his fear, not death, but the final, absolute systemic denial of his reality. Scan confirmed, Var reported, his voice dripping with skepticism. The anomalous signature matches the bridge logs, but the physical profile remains level 3. Propulsion. There was a heavy, condemning pause. Admiral, this is illogical. We should utilize the emergency override protocol. This individual is a variable we cannot afford. Commander Var, Kalia's voice cut in, overriding the tactical officer with controlled authority. The EOP is calculated for a 12-hour recovery cycle. We have less than 4 hours to reach the rendezvous point. NCO Rylan represents a possible 1-hour solution. Guide him. Var gritted his teeth, audible through the strained comms. Proceed down the main conduit, Rylan. Do not touch the wall paneling. Do not attempt to engage the internal network access ports. Rylan started walking, his pace measured. He understood Kalia was using him as a high-risk time saver, a necessary impurity. He also understood Var's duty-bound hostility. Var was the living embodiment of the system that Rylan had spent his life circumventing. As he moved, the structural speaker hissed again. Admiral, the external monitoring shows a spike in localized energy signatures, Var reported, his tone now laced with genuine alarm, not just institutional disgust. The hard lock frequency is radiating through the primary hull plating. It is broadcasting a signal. We look less like a disabled flagship and more like a high-value stationary target that just powered up its shield defenses to maximum capacity. The problem was indeed bigger. Protocol 73 Delta, Rylan suddenly realized, wasn't just a lock. It was a threat posture. Centuries ago, it had been designed to lock down a command vessel while simultaneously emitting a signal, not a distress call, but a powerful, disruptive frequency designed to jam localized enemy targeting systems. The shield hardening was preparation, not isolation. He hadn't just silenced the Juno Fate. He had painted a target on its back and simultaneously activated a massive, obsolete electronic countermeasure array. The lock is active defense, Admiral, Rylan transmitted, his voice calm despite the adrenaline surge. 73 Delta assumes external breach and broadcasts a frequency spike to neutralize close-range targeting if we don't disable it, we will attract attention from every opportunistic scavenger within a light year." "We are aware, technician," Var snarled. "That is precisely why we must adhere to the EOP and utilize the established chain of command, not rely on your alleged unique abilities." "The EOP takes 12 hours, Commander," Ryland countered, stopping at the base of the final access ladder. "In 12 hours, our archival matrice's rendezvous window is gone, and the fleet alignment fails. In 12 hours, whatever is drawn by this radiating signal will be on our doorstep." Ryland looked up the ladder shaft toward the bridge entry hatch, a thick plate of armored durasteel that was the final obstacle. He knew the drill. Even if Kalia ordered it open, Var would ensure the procedure was painfully slow and filled with arbitrary security checks. They were wasting precious time arguing protocol when physics was already declaring war on them. "I am at the primary bridge access hatch," Ryland announced. "Admiral, the longer we delay, the more heat we draw. I need to be inside, near the original transmitter. The inverse key requires full-spectrum proximity to the acoustic generator's core components." "Stand by, Ryland," Kalia ordered. "Commander Var and I are establishing the final security parameters." Ryland felt the low thrum of the emergency cycle suddenly drop. A high-pitched squeal ripped through the structural speaker, followed by absolute, profound silence. The ancient, hard-wired structural comms had just failed entirely. Ryland was cut off. He was standing in a sealed, pressurized corridor, 5 meters from the highest security area on the flagship, with only the unblinking small eye of the optical lens connecting him to the decision-makers. They could no longer speak to him. They could only see him. Ryland closed his eyes for a beat, letting the cold reality sink in. This was perfect. Kalia and Var were now in a silent, locked vault, relying entirely on visual judgment. No more verbal harassment, no more protocol debates. He pulled the frequency modulator from his belt pouch. He needed to get to the bridge, and he couldn't wait for them to visually confirm his obedience for every centimeter. This was the moment of pragmatic treason. Ryland ignored the optical lens and slammed the crude modulator against the access ladder railing, using the ship's metal as a conductor. He rapidly reconfigured the wires, ignoring the hot sting as current pulsed back through the salvaged metal, seeking to overload the manual locking mechanism on the final hatch. He was attempting to brute force a multi-century-old electronic lock, not with digital code, but with pure chaotic energy tuned to the system's failure frequency. The ladder shuddered violently. Sparks spat from the hatch plate. Ryland felt a searing pain across his palm as the diagnostic tool, stressed past its capacity, snapped in two. The shattered edge carved a clean, deep line across his right hand, immediately blooming dark blood onto the metallic railing. But the hatch groaned. The immense, satisfying sound of locking mechanisms failing under physical duress reverberated through the corridor. Ryland ignored the throbbing pain, pushing the door with his shoulder. It yielded, scraping violently as the damaged structural integrity bent the seal. He stepped onto the bridge access deck, the fresh scent of his own blood mingling with the sterile, rationed air. He was bleeding, he was exposed, and he was absolutely silent. Ryland raised his eyes. The bridge was bathed in the eerie inverted black of the locked primary display. Two figures, Kalia and Var, were frozen mid-argument, staring at him. Var's hand was near the safety console. But Rylan didn't look at them. His gaze went straight to the main command console. Beside the darkened master display, on a panel that should have been sealed and dormant, was an antique, copper-rimmed port, the pre-collapse acoustic generator unit. It was physically open, the internal mechanism exposed, and surrounding the exposed port, Ryland saw fresh, hot scorch marks radiating outward. Someone else had already attempted to interface with Protocol 73 Delta recently, violently, and failed. And standing next to that scorched panel, his back to Ryland, was a third figure Ryland hadn't expected. A technician in a Level 1 propulsion suit, fiddling frantically with a cluster of wires. Ryland immediately recognized the technician's wide, hunched posture, trained in the deep, low-ceiling repair bays. The man turned, hearing the scrape of the failing hatch. It wasn't the enemy. It was Jensen, Ryland's former apprentice from the outer yards, the one Ryland had trained to be invisible, the one who should have been nowhere near the Juno Fiae. Jensen's eyes went wide with panic, not at Ryland's arrival, but at what he was holding. A crude, melted attempt at a frequency modulator identical to Ryland's, completely destroyed by overload. Jensen looked at Ryland, then back at the scorched panel, and then whispered a single, terrified word into the suffocating silence of the bridge. "Ryland, it's not the lock, it's the trap." Ryland didn't need to ask what Jensen meant by trap. The silence of the bridge, which had felt like an opportunity just seconds before, now felt like the held breath before execution. He saw the panicked realization flood Jensen's face. The scorched copper port wasn't a sign of an attempted fix. It was proof that someone had intentionally allowed Ryland's voice, his unique harmonic signature, to activate the lock. Jensen's own failed melted modulator was the evidence that the key was the point of failure, not the solution. Admiral Kalia and Commander Var remained frozen, watching the silent exchange between the two low-level technicians, their faces pale in the ambient emergency light. They were observing, calculating the threat, unable to hear the single word, trap, that had just shattered Ryland's entire paradigm. Ryland moved first, abandoning the high-security optics. He strode across the deck, his worn boots silent on the armored plating, his bleeding hand throbbing a violent rhythm against the cold air. He passed Kalia without acknowledging her, his focus absolute. The pre-collapse acoustic generator. "Get off the panel, Jensen," Ryland commanded, his voice a low, hard rasp that seemed to cut through the inverted blackness of the bridge display. Jensen, a Level 1 mechanic who lived and died by adherence to Level 3 protocol, was shaking. He looked like a deer caught in high beams, terrified by the environment, but more terrified by Ryland's unexpected presence. "I tried, Ryland. I heard the harmonic spike. I knew it was the 73 Delta signature, but I didn't know who. I just tried to reverse the polarity, but the coils rejected the input. It took everything I had." Jensen gestured vaguely at the small antique port, then back at the admiral, begging for a rational explanation. "It's drawing power from the primary reactor core, not the auxiliary. The longer it's on, the deeper the systemic roots grow." Ryland shoved Jensen aside. The physical contact was a jolt of necessary urgency. He pressed his face close to the scorched acoustic generator, ignoring the acrid smell of burnt circuitry. Attempt 1. Reversal via direct input. Failure. Ryland pulled the remaining half of his frequency modulator, the delicate cluster of relays he had just used to brute force the hatch, and prepared to apply the inverse key. If 73 delta was a lock, the precise inverse harmonic would act like an acoustic eraser, forcing the lock to dismantle its physical structure. He needed 3 seconds of clean energy transfer. His bleeding hand fumbled momentarily with the wires. The pain wasn't distracting, but the systemic fatigue was. He had been running on fumes, fueled only by the belief in his superior knowledge of obsolete systems. The frequency chose me, he had told Kalia, but now it felt like a curse. He slammed the wires into the open port. A dull, rhythmic pulse vibrated through the casing, and Rylan waited for the release. Instead of the satisfying click of disengagement, the entire primary display system, the immense panel of black glass covering the bridge's forward view, flickered. Not off, but on, revealing a single cryptic image. The simplified schematic of the Juno Quaefiti, colored a stark, aggressive red. And at the exact center of the schematic, the acoustic generator unit pulsed like a grotesque, beating heart. The hard lock was not releasing. It was integrating. "It's hostile takeover, Rylan," Jensen whispered, eyes darting between Rylan and the silent judging presence of Kalia and Var. Protocol 73 Delta wasn't designed to lock friendly fleets out. It was designed to lock enemy operators in. The tension in the bridge tightened, becoming physically palpable, a dense medium that restricted breath. Rylan had been operating under the assumption that the hard lock was a historical bug, an accidental defense system. Jensen's frantic, terrified whisper confirmed the worst. 73 Delta was a sophisticated, self-sustaining capture mechanism meant to turn the command ship into a weapon under the control of the person who provided the vocal key. Rylan pulled the wires back out. The small diagnostic tool was now smoking, failing the sheer energy demand. He calculated the implications in the split second before the captain or commander could react. The system had used his voice as an administrator key, and now it was using the Juno Aure's massive reactor power to stabilize that key. He was not locked out. He was functionally, technologically, the highest authority on the ship, a Level 3 mechanic now controlling the flagship via a glitch in the security system. Attempt 2, system bypass via thermal shock. Failure, cost, critical. He scanned the immediate area. Kalia was still at the main helm, watching. Var, the rigid tactical officer, made his move slow and deliberate toward the emergency comms panel, a secondary line that would allow him to bypass the 73 Delta lock and broadcast a mayday on a compressed, non-standard frequency, revealing their location to any nearby patrols. Rylan couldn't allow a mayday. That would confirm the ship was compromised by an internal anomaly, him triggering immediate violent quarantine protocols by the nearest military force. He grabbed a thermal regulator unit off a nearby station, a heavy cylinder designed to rapidly cool plasma conduits, and slammed it against the base of the acoustic generator. The goal: shock the ancient coils with a sudden temperature drop, forcing a temporary electrical collapse that might destabilize the hard lock. The Juno's fate shuddered violently, a deep, resonant tremor that traveled through Rylan's bones. This time, the effect was far worse than simply failing to release the lock. The emergency lights, previously a consistent red, flickered, then dimmed to a near-total blackness, leaving the bridge illuminated only by the aggressive, pulsing red schematic on the view screen. The structural comms, previously dead, spat static, and Var's voice, distorted by the power surge, roared through the bridge's internal speakers, not directed at Rylan, but at Kalia. "Admiral, the hard lock just disabled all non-essential power conduits. We're running on deep reserve only. The long-range sensor array is flatlining. It's not jammed, it's overridden. We are blind." Var had gained ground. His initial disgust was replaced by cold tactical calculation. He was analyzing the lock's effect and reporting the consequences to Kalia, making Rylan the undeniable source of system-wide failure. The hard lock was cutting power to anything that could detect external threats, making the Juno 8 a cold, defenseless target waiting for the scavengers Rylan had warned about. Rylan had not just failed to solve the problem, he had exponentially worsened the ship's defensive posture, confirming Var's absolute assessment that he was an unacceptable variable. He felt a sudden, sharp pressure on his shoulder. It was Jensen. The apprentice was no longer shaking. Panic had distilled into focused terror. "Rylan, look!" Jensen breathed, his voice barely audible above the low structural groan of the cooling-down regulator. He pointed to the exposed internal mechanics of the generator unit. "The copper coil. It's wired into the old life support regulator. If you try to invert the harmonic again, it will read it as a systemic shutdown command." Jensen looked at him, his face a mask of pleading. "The lock isn't just integrated into the power grid. It's using our oxygen supply as a fail-safe. If you kill the lock, you kill the primary life support cycle for the whole bridge crew." Ryland staggered back a step, the metal taste of radiation, or was it fear, flooding his mouth. This was the trap. His voice was the administrator key, but the system had been pre-wired to treat any attempt at release as an execution command. The creator of Protocol 73 Delta hadn't just wanted the ship captured. They wanted the enemy, the person using the key, to be trapped between control and mass murder. "Who wired it?" Ryland demanded, looking from the scorched panel to Jensen, his eyes narrowed with lethal intensity. Who had access to the pre-collapse generator port and knew the structure well enough to set this up? Jensen looked terrified, then guilty, then finally resigned. I don't know who set the bomb, Ryland, but I know who had the tools." He pointed a shaking finger across the darkened bridge, past the silent Admiral Kalia, past the furious Commander Var, toward a third console, normally dedicated to secondary propulsion metrics. Ryland saw the small portable diagnostic kit sitting neatly on the console surface, a kit belonging only to Level 1 technicians, but containing tools far too sophisticated for their pay grade. "That kit belongs to Jax," Jensen whispered, naming a name Ryland vaguely recognized from the shift roster. Jax was working on the external comms array 3 hours ago. He reported a minor surge and filed for immediate shore leave. He left that kit behind. The secondary element, Jax's kit. Jax, a Level 1 technician whose profile was non-anomalous, non-threatening. He had provided the tools and the opportunity for the lock to be activated, likely wiring the life support failsafe, and then vanished. He wasn't the antagonist, but the necessary precursor. The trap wasn't the voice. The trap was the system's engineered compliance with the voice. Kalia, interpreting the panicked whispers and Ryland's sudden immobility, finally broke the silence she had been forced into. She moved quickly, expertly, reaching the main helm and pulling a heavy, metallic rod from its housing, a short, non-lethal stasis rod used for internal crowd control. Var, seeing his chance, abandoned the dead comms panel and moved to intercept Rylan, pulling a small sidearm. "Admiral, let me neutralize him," Var demanded, his voice hard and absolute, even if only Rylan could hear the intention in the structural vibration. Rylan had seconds. He had only one option left, and it was the most dangerous. Attempt 3. Forced system crash via acoustic feedback. He had to trigger a system crash, not a disengagement. He needed to flood the acoustic generator with a white noise signal of such power and complexity that it couldn't parse the data, forcing a systemic reboot that might bypass the life support failsafe. He needed maximum chaotic energy. Rylan looked at Jensen. "The primary comms repeater array on Deck 5. Is it still wired to the old second expansion power supply?" Jensen nodded frantically. "Yes, but it's locked down by the siege mode. You can't reach it." "The coil in the generator unit," Rylan said, pointing at the scorched copper. "It's not just absorbing energy, it's amplifying frequency. It's broadcasting the 73 delta signal. We need to turn the broadcast frequency back onto itself. A feedback loop." Rylan quickly grabbed the stasis rod from Kalia's hand as she approached, startling her momentarily. He ignored the Admiral's glare and jammed the rod, a conductor designed to handle massive energy surges, back into the scorched port, bypassing the generator's safety interlocks entirely. "Jensen, take Jax's kit," Rylan yelled, his voice strained. "Find the old frequency calibrator. If we can tune the feedback loop to exactly 47, 9 hertz, the base frequency of the Juno Theta's resonant dampeners, we won't just kill the lock. We'll crash the entire operating system, forcing a cold reboot." This was no longer a fix. It was an act of computational destruction. A forced cold reboot of a flagship under hard lock would risk systemic structural failure, but it was the only way to avoid the life support failsafe. Jensen fumbled with the alien toolkit, his face pale with horror. Var was closing in, his sidearm raised, pointed not at Ryland's center mass, but at his shoulder, a calculated, non-lethal shot designed to disable the hands. The stasis rod began to glow a violent, angry blue where it met the acoustic generator. The energy feedback loop was initiated. Rylan ignored the heat, ignored Var's silent threat, focusing only on the subtle, escalating whine coming from the generator. The ship began to shake again, not with a deep rumble, but with a high-frequency vibration that rattled Rylan's teeth and blurred his vision. Var fired. The shot was a compressed burst of non-kinetic energy. Rylan barely registered the impact as the charge struck his already injured right hand. The pain was immediate, searing, and complete. The hand that held the stasis rod went instantly numb, the fingers curling into a useless claw. He dropped the rod. It clattered across the metallic deck. The feedback loop immediately severed. The blue glow vanished. The structural whine died. Rylan looked down at his ruined hand, the skin blackened and smoking where the blast hit. The system was now stable, deeply integrated, and unyielding. The cold reboot attempt had failed, and the lock had responded by crippling the key. Kalia, seeing Rylan defenseless and wounded, moved swiftly, retrieving the dropped stasis rod and tossing it away. She was not aiming to kill, but to contain. Var stood over Rylan, the sidearm lowered slightly, his face set in a grim, satisfied expression. Rylan was kneeling, clutching his disabled hand, his tactical advantage entirely annihilated. He was isolated, wounded, and the hard lock was now stronger than ever. The immense bridge display, having stabilized from the power surge, now displayed a new message in huge, pulsing red font across the schematic of the captive ship. 73 Delta. Lock integration complete. System operational. Initiating target acquisition. External commence in 5 minutes. The silence returned, but it was heavier now, charged with the certainty of imminent detection. Ryland looked up at Kalia and Var, then at Jensen, who had dropped Jax's kit in terror. The trap had sprung, and in 5 minutes the Juno V-8 would cease being a disabled flagship and start broadcasting its threat posture, a massive, high-value target for destruction. Ryland looked at the admiral, his vision blurring, and his mind, despite the pain, working with terrible clarity. The lock was fully integrated. It was using the Juno Aphes systems to broadcast a massive homing beacon. And he had just discovered that Jax, the vanishing Level 1 technician, was not the enemy. He was simply the messenger. "Admiral," Ryland croaked, the pain forcing his voice into a harmonic far deeper than the one that had triggered the lock. The archival matrices, it wasn't the retrieval mission. It was the bait. Admiral Kalia did not waste the remaining 300 seconds. She ignored Ryland, ignoring the kneeling, bleeding technician who had just declared the mission a deliberate deception. Instead, Kalia moved to the tactical console where Commander Var was still standing rigid, sidearm held ready. She placed her uninjured hand on Var's arm. The silence of the bridge made the interaction a tableau of contained violence. Kalia spoke, her voice audible only through the remaining structural vibration aimed directly at Var but intended for Ryland. "Commander, the target acquisition sequence is non-negotiable. If that signal broadcasts, we are dead. Your EOP requires 12 hours. We have 4 minutes. Var, seeing his chance to reassert order, shook off her hand. "He is compromised, Admiral. His actions cause this integration. Protocol dictates. Protocol is obsolete." Kalia cut him off, her voice cracking the sterile air. She turned her fierce gaze onto Ryland, still clutching his ruined right hand. "Ryland, explain the bait, now." Ryland forced the words out, the pain from the blast making his jaw rigid. "The archival matrices, the pre-collapse data. It's not historical records. It's an archive of highly specific frequency profiles. A census. My profile is recorded there. Someone knew the retrieval window, knew I was working the dampeners, and they ensured the Vespidade 2 had the ancient second expansion coils installed, coils only receptive to 73 Delta. Ryland swallowed a hot rush of fear and bile. The lock wasn't accidental. It was a digital dragnet. They needed someone with my harmonic signature, unknown to current command, to activate the system. Jax, the mechanic, he pre-wired the life support failsafe, then vanished. He set the tripwire. My voice was the target. Kalia nodded once, a sharp, terrible confirmation. "And what does the system do now that it has the key and is integrated?" "The message on the display is a lie, Admiral," Ryland grated, pointing to the pulsing red schematic. "Target acquisition is not standard threat posture. This is an archaic function. 73 Delta uses the flagship's power core to amplify the broadcast frequency. It's turning the Juno V-8 into an acoustic weapon, not a homing beacon, a disruption array aimed at the nearest orbital traffic routes." Silence fell, absolute and damning. Jensen's eyes widened to dinner plates. Var's control fractured, a flicker of pure horror crossing his face as he looked at the primary navigation charts, still visible on a secondary backup screen. The nearest orbital traffic route wasn't military. It was the massive, slow-moving Palace civilian transport, carrying 18,000 colonists. Kalia stepped away from Var, moving directly to Rylan. We know, the archival faction. They want to expose Command's reliance on pre-collapse technology by destroying a civilian target and framing it on systemic failure. We intercepted their transmission 3 hours ago, confirming the target acquisition sequence. That is why I ordered the retrieval mission accelerated. Kalia knelt beside Rylan, dropping her official composure entirely. We knew the trap was set, Rylan, but we didn't know who the key was until you spoke on the comms. We needed you to complete the alignment and activate the lock, then provide the full spectral profile to cancel the weapon before integration. Rylan looked at her, confusion warring with agonizing pain. You set me up. You risked 18,000 civilians just to identify a rogue mechanic. I risked them hoping you would save them. Kalia whispered, her voice rough. Now listen, Level 3. The acoustic weapon is active. The broadcast will initiate in T-2 minutes. The failsafe is active. Kill the lock, kill the crew. But the life support connection is physical, not frequency-based. Kalia reached out and grabbed Rylan's good left hand. Her grip was iron. We have one option. We cannot kill the lock. We must override it with a higher authority key, a frequency so complex, so saturated with chaotic energy, that 73 Delta cannot parse it as an attack command, only a systemic priority override. Rylan stared at the blackened, useless wreck of his right hand. Var disabled the hand that held the stasis rod. I can't stabilize the frequency. You don't need the stasis rod, Kalia said, her eyes burning with terrible conviction. You need the pain. The kinetic blast Var used was non-lethal, but it saturates the nerve endings with electromagnetic chaos. Your voice harmonic is non-standard. The pain just made it unique. It created the perfect high-entropy override key. Kalia pulled Rylan's throbbing, ruined right hand toward the scorched acoustic generator unit. She quickly snatched a thin, non-conductive medical wire from Var's abandoned kit and secured Rylan's fingers in a rigid, curved position, forcing the black fingertips into the smallest open port on the generator casing. This system uses structural conductivity, Kalia explained, moving with the brutal, efficient logic of a commander backed into a corner. We need the maximum residual electric chaos from your damaged nerves to flood the coil, but you must transmit the harmonic verbally at full power to provide the frequency signature. This will use your pain as the key, Rylan. The immense display flickered. -1. 30. Var, still frozen between fury and fear, managed to regain his voice. Admiral, that is highly unstable. If the harmonic fails, the feedback loop could collapse the reactor shielding. Silence, Commander, Kalia commanded, never taking her eyes off Rylan. The choice is simple, NCO. You attempt this, risking death and guaranteed exposure of your identity across the entire command structure, or you watch 18,000 civilians turn into static noise. Rylan felt the weight of the moment crush him, heavier than the siege mode or the failure of his previous attempts. He realized the true nature of his dilemma: anonymity or mass survival. His whole life had been about hiding his lineage, flattening his identity, surviving as a ghost in the system. To broadcast this frequency, amplified by a flagship, was to declare himself an anomaly, ensuring that command would hunt him forever, not as a Level 3 NCO, but as the one and only operator with the forbidden key. The voice that betrayed me will now save me, but at the cost of everything I used the silence to build. He looked at his hand, fused to the console by Kalia's quick wiring, throbbing with an unbearable, constant thrum of internal electrical chaos. He had 10 years of suppression to overcome, 10 years of filing down the edges of his voice, making it non-threatening, compliant. Now, he had to unleash the full, raw, chaotic power of his genetic anomaly, amplified by the searing pain Var had inflicted. "If I succeed," Rylan rasped, the words barely escaping his throat, "the system will record the inverse key, my identity. What happens then?" Kalia didn't look away, but the intensity in her eyes softened, replaced by a cold, operational regret. "If you succeed, we live, and you, NCO Rylan, will be the most sought-after technician, or the highest priority target, in the fleet. I will ensure your survival until the palace is clear." "A promise from the admiral who used me as bait," Rylan muttered, not as an accusation, but as a statement of fact. -1. He chose 0. Rylan nodded slowly. He chose the living over the ghost he pretended to be. He chose the concrete survival of 18,000 over the abstract integrity of his suppressed identity. He took a deep, shuddering breath, filling his lungs with the rationed, sterile air. He focused all his awareness on the searing, electrical heat radiating from his hand, converting the pure agony into intent. He didn't need to speak clearly. He needed to transmit the harmonic frequency with total, unyielding power. He leaned into the microphone conduit and screamed. It wasn't a scream of terror or physical agony, though it contained both. It was a modulated, intentional sound, a harmonic generated from the deepest core of his being, riding the wave of pain and adrenaline. It was the sound of Rylan, the Level 3 acoustic NCO, finally dropping the mask. The sound wave struck the acoustic generator. The generator coil, now fused to his injured hand, vibrated wildly, the copper humming a frequency too high for human hearing, yet physically palpable. The bridge lights, still dim to the pulsating red of siege mode, suddenly flared violently white, then died completely. The ship shuddered, not with a deep rumble, but with an internal crack, the sound of ancient metal yielding to overwhelming energy. Var cried out, stumbling back from the blast of light. Jensen instinctively covered his ears. Kalia remained rock-steady beside Rylan, watching the main display. The pulsing red schematic of the Juno bait vanished entirely. The display inverted back to absolute black. The profound silence of the hard lock returned, but this time it was cleaner, lighter. The silence of a power system momentarily collapsed, not defensively imposed. Rylan collapsed, pulling his body weight away from the generator, tearing the medical wire securing his hand. The pain was still there, but muted, replaced by a seismic physical exhaustion. Kalia immediately moved to the secondary console, slamming a series of manual overrides. "System status!" she barked, her voice hoarse. A secondary data display, a minimal, low-power screen, flickered green. "Delta Lock disengaged. Cold reboot initiating. Kalia released a shaky breath. Success! The hard lock is down. We should have comms and sensors back in 60 seconds. VAR confirmed the Palace is still on course and reporting normal telemetry. VAR scrambled to the console, his movements heavy and unsteady. He was defeated, his protocol rendered irrelevant by Ryland's chaotic success. Ryland lay on the cold deck, staring at the black ceiling. He had saved them. He had destroyed his life of anonymity, but he had saved the ship. Then the secondary data display, the minimal screen, flickered again, displaying a message that had bypassed the cold reboot sequence entirely. It wasn't an operational message. It was a data transfer log. Transfer complete. Archival matrix. 73D2A. Target. Command personnel. Admiral Kalia. Status. Received. Ryland forced his head to turn toward Kalia. The data transfer had occurred the second the inverse harmonic was successfully broadcast. The archaic system hadn't just disengaged. It had performed its full protocol, recognizing Ryland's voice as the historical administrator key and completing a century-old data dump, a critical archival matrix, straight into the private command terminal, and that terminal was Admiral Kalia's. Kalia stared at the small green screen, her face white, all the controlled fury replaced by naked, absolute horror. She was looking not at the successful protocol, but at the name of the recipient. "Admiral," Ryland whispered, the truth cutting through his exhaustion. "That archive, it wasn't meant for retrieval. It was an encrypted file tethered to the administrator key, my voice. What did 73 Delta just send you?" Kalia, unable to stop herself, reached out and touched the small screen. The file instantly opened, the screen filled with text. Ryland couldn't read the content, but he saw the date, pre-collapse, and he saw the signature line at the bottom glowing in stark white. Kalia looked up, her breathing shallow, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and dawning understanding. She finally spoke, her voice flat, devoid of emotion, confirming the final, irreversible betrayal. "The archival matrix wasn't the bait for me, Ryland, and the archival faction wasn't the one who set the trap." Kalia pointed one shaking finger back at the pulsing green screen where the content had scrolled up to reveal the file title. The file confirms the original pre-collapse purpose of Protocol 73 Delta. It wasn't a defense system against external threats. It was designed for internal execution. Ryland felt a cold, final dread sink into his core. He had been used as the key, not for salvation, but for self-destruction. "And who," Ryland asked, his voice barely a breath, "is the target of the execution?" Kalia closed her eyes, and when she opened them, Ryland saw not the Admiral, but a hunted animal. "The target of the execution," she said, nodding at the file title, "is the current fleet command structure. Ryland, you didn't just disengage the lock. You just used your voice, amplified by the flagship, to broadcast a pre-collapse mandate. You just declared war on the entire fleet. Before we proceed, log your entry. Which country or planet are you watching from right now? The commander is tracking every active signal. The price of the successful override arrived not in fury, but in meticulous, clinical containment." 3 hours later, Ryland was alone, sealed in a sterile auxiliary medical bay deep within the Juno Warehouse lower decks. The cold reboot had restored minimal power, enough for structural integrity and basic lighting, but not enough for comfort. The silence was now institutional, the dead acoustic channels replaced by the faint, high-pitched whine of the bay's recycled air, a sound that only served to emphasize the absolute lack of external communication. His right hand, scorched and crippled by Var's blast, was secured in a rigid polymer brace, fused to a low-power biometric interface unit. The unit was not for healing, it was for control. Every minute, the system sampled the electromagnetic noise radiating from his damaged nerves, ensuring they had a baseline reading of the chaos he had used to save the palace. The pain was a constant, blinding white background radiation against the silence. Commander Var stood opposite him, separated by a pane of thick, reinforced glass. Var was no longer furious. He was calculating, precise. He wore a sterile medical apron over his uniform, the sidearm holstered but visible. "You should be grateful, Level 3, Var stated, his voice projected through a tight beam speaker, devoid of any structural vibration that Rylan could analyze. Admiral Kalia intervened personally. My initial recommendation, logged at T-minus 45 seconds before the palace was secured, was immediate termination and system wipe. Rylan didn't respond. He simply focused on the display before him, a small, low-power terminal that had been hardwired to Kalia's private command console. He was forced to watch the real-time fallout of his success. The screen confirmed that the pre-collapse execution mandate was propagating across the fleet's archaic sensor grids. It wasn't a viral attack. It was a systemic declaration. "The mandate is simple, Rylan," Var continued, leaning closer to the glass. "It declares the current command structure compromised by foreign elements and mandates a purge cycle. The fleet's ancient defense platforms are being silently activated, reassigning target priority from external threats to internal assets. Specifically, any vessel broadcasting a modern, high-bandwidth comm frequency, they are treating the flagship as the origin point of a systemic breakdown." Rylan finally spoke, his voice dry and strained. "The palace is clear. That's what matters." Var laughed, a short, sharp sound that conveyed perfect contempt. "The palace is a statistical footnote. You saved 18,000 colonists, Rylan, and in exchange, you have just implicated over 3 million active service members in a non-existent conspiracy. You traded a localized threat for an existential internal war. Was that the intention of your chaos harmonic?" The question slammed Rylan against the wall of his own moral exhaustion. He had acted on necessity, on the immediate, tangible threat to the palace. But Var's brutal clarity exposed the true scope of his failure. He had confirmed Command's deepest fear, that internal threats, rooted in forgotten history, could collapse the entire structure. "The command fleet is reacting exactly as expected," Var reported, his finger tapping a data point on his side of the glass. "Admiral Kalia has ordered a temporary communications blackout, a technical glitch cover story. But the mandate is smarter than her strategy. It is using the comm blackout to confirm its own internal execution protocol. Every ship that goes dark to hide from the mandate is being tagged by the mandate as a compliant target for purge cycle." Rylan felt the crushing weight of his exposed identity. He had risked everything to save his anonymity, then sacrificed it to save strangers. And the system simply used his sacrifice as proof of the need for its own self-destruction. The mandate requires 2 active keys for final confirmation of the purge cycle, Var explained, his tone almost instructional. Yours was the first, the biological, acoustic key. The second is a physical presence code. The mandate is currently analyzing all active biometric IDs on the bridge at the time of activation. Rylan knew what this meant. Jensen, Kalia, Var, all of them were now potential secondary keys, unless they could be manually wiped from the mandate's short-term memory before the mandate completed its analysis. And Jax? Rylan asked, the name tasting like ash. The mechanic who pre-wired the trap. Var smirked, a sliver of victory visible on his face. Jax? Jax doesn't exist, Rylan. His Level 1 profile was wiped 3 months ago by Kalia's own Black Ops unit. He was a digital ghost used to deliver the trap. The archival faction wasn't attacking Command. They were manipulating Command into triggering the mandate themselves. They used Kalia's fear of the mandate to make her seek out the key. You were the pawn delivered by the Queen. Rylan closed his eyes. He wasn't a ghost in the machine anymore. He was the anchor, the focal point around which the entire storm now raged. He looked down at his broken hand, the throbbing pain a monument to his colossal arrogance. You thought you were a savior. You were just a highly specialized tool, a single-use wrench designed centuries ago to break the system from the inside. They didn't care about your 10 years of silence. They only cared about the potential noise. He felt a deep, profound self-judgment. He had spent his life running from the identity that defined him, only to embrace it at the critical moment, giving the system exactly what it needed. He wasn't a hero driven by principle. He was a coward driven by guilt over past failures, trying to buy back his innocence with the lives of 18,000 civilians. Why keep fighting? The thought slid into his mind, cold and welcome. The fight was unwinnable. He had declared war on the entire fleet. His family's history, the very genetics he'd hidden, was now public domain across every deep archive terminal in the fleet. There was no going back to Level 3, no return to the anonymity he cherished. All his efforts had been rendered meaningless, replaced by the certainty of his capture or execution. He considered the sterile syringe resting on the console tray a pain inhibitor provided by Var. It would stop the thrumming agony in his hand, but it was also a sedative. He could simply take it, drift away, and let the chaos swallow the Junos Fadae. It would be a surrender, an easy death, escaping the burden of being the key. "Take the inhibitor, Rylan," Var's voice commanded, sensing the moment of hesitation. "You're useful to us alive, but not if you collapse from exhaustion. We need you to manually confirm the final purge cycle initiation code. Kalia wants to know exactly where the mandate will hit first." Rylan looked at the syringe, then back at the console. To confirm the purge cycle was to commit fully to the internal war. To surrender was to accept the mandate's victory and his own irrelevance. He picked up the syringe, his good hand shaken, and snapped it in half against the polymer brace, shattering the glass and spilling the clear liquid onto the sterile floor. "I won't confirm the purge cycle," Rylan stated, ignoring the sharp reprimand Var barked through the speaker. "The mandate is running on borrowed power. Protocol 73 Delta requires sustained energy flow through the pre-collapse generator. If the generator overloads, the mandate crashes. not gracefully, but violently. Var's calculating composure finally cracked. "It will take the entire reactor core with it, NCO. We lose structural integrity. The flagship dies." "You were going to terminate me anyway," Rylan countered, meeting Var's furious gaze through the glass. "At least this way, I choose the method of destruction." He returned his attention to the small monitor. His damaged hand, fused to the biometric unit, provided a constant low-level data stream. As Ryland stared at the scrolling data, the final details of the mandate, he saw a pattern, a recurring loop in the archaic pre-collapse code. It wasn't a standard encryption. It was an instability. Educational element. The original pre-collapse architects, assuming the system would only be operated by fully trained personnel, had left a back door, a feature they called a resonance buffer override, a way to stop the mandate mid-cycle by hitting it with a specific, hyperdense data package that would exceed its parsing capacity, forcing a system overload and immediate shutdown. The mandate wasn't just using the Juno Pi's power. It was using the ship's massive primary transmission array to amplify the mandate across the sector. "Var, the mandate isn't targeting ships," Rylan realized, pointing a trembling finger at the data. "It's targeting infrastructure. Command's primary data nexus, the Juno Fate's auxiliary orbital station, the Icarus Vipers." Var blanched, finally realizing the true tactical threat. The Icarus Vipers stored the fleet's entire logistical and operational framework. If the mandate hit that, the command structure would become immediately, functionally, blind. "The mandate is on a timer," Rylan explained, his mind working with a terrifying clarity that transcended the pain. "It's not waiting for confirmation. It's waiting for alignment. When the Juno 8M passes the precise vector, the mandate will utilize the primary comm array to fire the execution payload at the Icarus Vipers." "When is the vector alignment?" Var demanded, grabbing a tactical monitor. "In 20 minutes, Ryland said, looking at the clock on his console. Ryland saw the opportunity, the crack in the foundation of the trap. The mandate was using the flagship's high-power primary comm array for the attack. That array was currently running under the mandate's control, but it was still physically connected to the ship's internal network, feeding data directly from the pre-collapse generator. Ryland forced his trembling good hand to the biometric unit, pulling up the schematic of the primary comm array. He had one chance. He could route the hyperdense data package, the resonance buffer override, through the comm array, using the massive transmission power to overload the pre-collapse generator coil just as it prepared to fire the execution mandate. The array would act as a conduit for the chaotic overload. But to access the comm array's internal conduit, he needed to physically interface with the secondary propulsion console, the one Jensen and Jax had used near the bridge. Var had locked Rylan 5 decks below. Rylan looked back at the data stream running through his broken hand. The stream wasn't just pain metrics. It was the mandate's operational telemetry, the mandate's raw thoughts. He saw a single line of code flash rapidly, an unexpected command that had just been received by the mandate. It wasn't an instruction from Kalia or Var. It was an external, coded burst of data, so dense and fleeting that only Ryland's hardwired terminal operating on the fringe of the system could detect it. The external data burst was a single word, encrypted With a pre-collapse key, Rylan recognized a civilian encryption profile from a long-dead sector. Directive: isolate key. Rylan felt a fresh wave of cold dread. The archival faction wasn't dead. They were external watching, and they had just ordered the mandate to isolate Rylan's bio key, his voice, before the final launch. If they isolated the key, Rylan would lose his connection to the system, rendering him unable to attempt the override. He would be locked out, forced to watch the Icarus VLRs burn. Rylan looked at Var. They know I'm the key. They are about to sever my connection. I need access to the bridge now. I have to use the primary comm array to overload the generator. Var, seeing the sheer panic in Rylan's eyes, wavered, caught between protocol and the tactical reality of losing the Icarus V. "The access locks are fried, Rylan," Var yelled. "We have no security clearance to override 5 deck levels of siege lock in 20 minutes. Rylan looked at his fused right hand, then down at the floor, where the sedative from the syringe had pooled. The broken glass sparkled on the sterile surface. He realized the solution was not about electronics or code. It was about leverage. Rylan's good hand shot out, grabbing a discarded piece of shattered polymer casing from the broken syringe. He slammed the jagged edge hard against the glass partition, separating him from Var. Not hard enough to break it, but hard enough to send a sharp, focused vibration through the rigid structure. He used the vibration to amplify his voice. "Commander Var," Rylan spoke, his voice low, steady, and amplified only by structural resonance, using his Level 3 acoustic knowledge one last time. "That mandate just logged your biometric ID as a secondary confirmation key. The moment it detects me cut off, it will use you to confirm the purge cycle against the Icarus V." Var stared, his jaw slack, the color draining from his face as the true cost of working so close to the mandate finally hit him. "You need me to crash the system, Var, not to save the Icarus Vix," Rylan stated, ignoring the sharp, fresh sting of cutting his own palm on the glass shard. "But to wipe your fingerprint from the command log before the mandate can use you for the execution." Rylan held Var's gaze, offering the only leverage he had left: shared, immediate self-preservation. Var hesitated for a terrifying 5 seconds, his military conditioning battling pure survival instinct. Then he moved. He slapped the emergency release on the isolation bay door. The heavy door hissed open. 20 minutes, Rylan," Var commanded, his voice tight with desperation. "You have 20 minutes to reach the propulsion console and crash the mandate, or I will use the remaining power to purge this ship entirely, starting with you." Rylan shoved himself off the floor, his vision momentarily swimming from the pain and exhaustion. He ignored Var, stumbling out of the sterile bay. He wasn't running towards the bridge. He was running towards a controlled demolition. He started climbing the emergency access ladder, the metallic rungs cold and unforgiving against his good hand, his bad hand radiating white-hot agony. The only path open was a vertical shaft, locked down by internal defense systems. He had to bypass 5 security decks manually, relying entirely on his physical memory of the ship's conduits. Halfway up the second deck, Rylan heard a structural groan and the faint, low-frequency hum of a heavy system powering up. It wasn't the mandate. It was a localized defense mechanism. Rylan looked up. A narrow laser-guided surveillance drone, silent and equipped with a non-lethal stasis emitter, was descending the shaft towards him. Var hadn't disabled the defense systems. He had sent a monitor. "I can't allow you to access the propulsion console unsupervised, Rylan." Var's voice cut in, amplified by the structural speaker near the drone. "Any deviation from the fastest route, and the drone terminates your nervous system." Rylan didn't pause. He kept climbing, pushing his body past the point of endurance. He felt the cold lens of the drone's camera fixed on the back of his neck. He was isolated, crippled, monitored, and running on borrowed time toward a device he intended to self-destruct. This was the bottom. Rylan looked up the shaft, realizing the full depth of his vulnerability. He was now a guided missile, aimed by the enemy, hoping to detonate at the right moment. Then he heard a small, faint sound through the dead comms, a residual vibration in the structural plating near a dormant air vent. It was a highly coded acoustic signal almost beyond human hearing, rooted in the same ancient protocols as 73 Delta. It was Jensen. The apprentice had routed a micro-frequency through the air ventilation system, hoping to bypass Var's monitoring. The signal contained only 3 numbers, repeated in a tight, frantic loop. 4750. Rylan instantly recognized the sequence. 47.50 Hz was the Juno Aphia secondary reactor core resonant frequency, the exact frequency needed to induce catastrophic system failure. Jensen wasn't telling Rylan to crash the system with the buffer override. Jensen was giving him the frequency to literally crack the core. Rylan understood the terrible implication. The Mandate was using the ship as a weapon. Rylan needed to use the ship against the Mandate, but the price of using the Mandate's attack array to broadcast the Task 47, 50 Hz in frequency, would be the Juno sect's absolute self-destruction. It was a trade. One flagship, one life. For the Icarus feast and the entire command fleet. Rylan looked up at the drone monitoring his every move. He had 20 minutes. One climb, one acoustic broadcast, one final chance at annihilation. He took a deeper breath, accepting the final truth. He was not going to survive this. His only utility now was as a suicide device. "Commander Var," Rylan called back up the shaft, his voice steadying, accepting his fate. "I am approaching the 4th deck transfer conduit. Prepare for system shock." As he spoke, the secondary screen in his hand flickered, receiving a second data burst, even tighter than Jensen's. It was a single, cryptic image, the schematic of the Juno de Piau's primary escape pod array. The image was overlaid with 3 pulsing green indicators, 3 life support seals active. Kalia wasn't planning on dying with the flagship. She had prepared a way out. Rylan realized his final, terrible leverage. He could destroy the ship, crash the Mandate, and take Kalia's escape route with him. Rylan clung to the ladder, the high-frequency hum of the descending drone directly above his head, the pain in his hand a screaming catalyst. He began the final climb toward the bridge, knowing that his salvation would be the ship's destruction, and the only escape would be secured with the ultimate betrayal. The cold lens of the descending drone fixed on Rylan's neck, a silent, buzzing executioner. He was 3 decks below the bridge, running a suicide route, monitored by the very man whose life he was attempting to save. The agony from his blasted right hand was no longer a distraction. It was the fuel for his terrible, final clarity. Rylan understood now. His chaos harmonic wasn't just a key. It was a detonation trigger, and he was the unstable charge. He reached the final segment of the emergency ladder shaft, the heavy durasteel plates feeling slick with his own sweat and the recycled moisture of the siege mode. The drone, sensing the slowing of his pace, emitted a sharp, high-frequency warning tone that traveled through the metal, a sound calculated to induce panic and force compliance. Rylan ignored the drone. He ignored Var's amplified voice, which was now a constant, tight snarl of commands and threats echoing from the structural speakers near the surveillance unit. "Rylan, 1 minute and 0 seconds to vector alignment. Deviate, and I neutralize you. Stay on the conduit." Rylan had 12 feet left to climb to the bridge access. He reached the hatch. It was sealed, heavy, but its manual override was disabled by Var's localized lock system. Rylan didn't have time to brute force it with energy feedback. He had to enter the code, and Var knew the emergency override sequence. Rylan looked up at the drone, its lens pulsing red. He held up his good left hand, showing the commander his movement. He wasn't attempting to open the hatch. He was aiming for the power conduit junction box adjacent to the hatch, a heavy armored panel that fed auxiliary power to the internal defense grid. He pulled the shattered polymer casing from his belt, the piece of the syringe that had already cut his palm, and slammed the jagged edge into the conduit seam, using his acoustic sensitivity to detect the weakest point in the metallic casing. The casing groaned, but held. "Stop, Rylan. That's a structural support line," Var roared. Rylan slammed the casing again, driving the jagged edge into the seam until it tore through the polymer insulation. He ignored the small cascade of sparks and the sharp, hot stench of burnt wiring. He was buying seconds, not power. The small data screen on his wrist flickered, the mandate's internal clock updating to -0, 45 seconds. He had to get inside. Now, Rylan looked at his right hand, fused to the biometric unit. The pain was peaking, a screaming symphony of fried nerves. This was his weapon. He yanked his right arm sharply toward the junction box. The polymer brace cracked against the metal casing, and the internal interface unit, the biometric sensor, sheared off the brace, remaining fused to his burning fingertips. He slammed the detached unit, dripping with blood and electrical noise, directly onto the exposed conduit wiring he had just ruptured. The immediate result was chaos. The junction box exploded in a shower of brilliant white sparks and black smoke. The drone above him sputtered, its stasis field dying instantly from the feedback overload, and it clattered harmlessly down the shaft. Var's voice vanished entirely, replaced by a profound, agonizing structural shriek as the ship's primary electrical grid attempted to absorb the massive localized surge of chaotic energy. Rylan was momentarily deafened, blinded by the flash, and the searing pain from his right hand intensified tenfold, but the acoustic chaos had done its work. The internal lock on the bridge access hatch, deprived of Var's sustaining power, simply collapsed. The hatch lock retracted with a heavy mechanical thunk. He slammed his shoulder against the heavy plate, forcing it open, and stumbled onto the bridge deck. Admiral Kalia and Commander Var were exactly where he had left them, frozen by the sudden power fluctuation. Kalia was braced against the main helm, staring at the secondary navigation monitor. Var was standing by the communication console, his face blackened by the proximity of the electrical surge, his sidearm now uselessly pointed at the deck plate. T -0, 30 seconds. Ryland moved past them, ignoring the wide, horrified eyes of Jensen, who was still trying to parse the sudden, localized destruction. Ryland's eyes were locked on the secondary propulsion console, the site of the original tampering, which housed the physical conduit to the primary comm array. "The Mandate is about to fire," Ryland rasped, his voice raw from the exertion and the feedback flash. "I have the resonance buffer override. I need the comm array conduit now." Kalia, recovering instantly, pointed to a small sealed access panel near the floor. "It's locked by manual pressure seal. Var, open it." Var, still reeling from the explosion and the sudden loss of control, reacted with rigid military logic. "The Mandate is utilizing that conduit. Opening it now risks systemic Mandate integration through the bridge systems." Ryland didn't wait. He dropped to his knees, ignoring the sickening, scraping sensation as the wrecked biometric unit on his hand dragged across the deck. He used his good left hand to tear at the manual pressure seal, realizing that Var wasn't delaying out of spite. He was delaying out of tactical principle. Var believed that delaying Mandate integration was worth the risk of losing the Icarus VI. Kalia, seeing Ryland fail to break the seal, moved swiftly. She placed her foot against the sealed panel and kicked, not with brute force, but with the precise directed kinetic energy of a commander who knew exactly where the weak points were. The seal popped open with a heavy hiss. Ryland didn't look up to thank her. He tore the access panel away, revealing a cluster of thick optical fiber cables. The conduit to -0, 20 seconds. He had the physical access. Now for the chaotic solution. Ryland pulled the remaining half of his makeshift frequency modulator, the delicate cluster of wires Jensen had dropped, and jammed the whole smoking mess into the exposed comm array conduit. He didn't care about correct pin configuration. He needed a physical, high-power bridge between his body and the comm array's power surge capacity. As the wires connected, the bridge display, the massive black screen, flickered again, displaying the red schematic, but now overlaid with a massive, pulsing white counter that read T-15. The Mandate was confirming its launch sequence. Ryland felt the comm array conduit vibrate violently in his grasp. The Mandate was using the flagship's entire transmission capacity to build the execution payload. He had milliseconds before the transmission achieved critical mass. Ryland ignored the override buffer. The chaotic data packet he had originally planned to use, it was too slow, too computationally complex. He remembered Jensen's frantic, desperate micro-frequency. 47-5-0. He looked at his right hand, now radiating pure, concentrated pain, the severed biometric unit still smoking on the floor. He needed to use the chaos harmonic, amplified by the comm array, not to override the Mandate, but to destroy the Mandate's foundation. He had to hit the 47. 50 Hz resonant frequency and induce catastrophic failure in the secondary reactor core, crashing the entire ship and the Mandate with it. "Admiral," Ryland croaked, his voice barely audible over the growing structural whine of the comm array. "I am initiating core resonance. Mandate crashes. Ship dies. You have 20 seconds to reach the escape pods." Var, having regained his tactical sense, stared at Ryland, his eyes wide with terrible realization. "You would sacrifice the Juno Aegis. Ryland, that is treason." Ryland looked up at Var, his face a mask of pain and exhaustion. I am a level 3 mechanic, Commander. Treason is above my pay grade. This is demolition." Ryland leaned close to the comm array conduit, his voice finding a terrifying resonant depth born of complete self-abandonment. He didn't need to scream this time. He needed to hum, to vibrate, to use the full internal chaos of his broken body as a tuning fork. He transmitted the harmonic, a low, guttural, steady vibration that bypassed the comm array's transmission filters and flowed directly into the main power conduit. The ship reacted instantly and catastrophically. The entire structure of the Juno 8 began to shake with a violent rhythmic intensity. This wasn't a rumble. It was a focused, high-frequency internal tremor, the metallic hull protesting the forced destabilization of its core components. Kalia, seeing the red structural integrity alarms flash across the remaining secondary monitors, grabbed Var's arm. "Evacuate! Now!" Var tore his arm away, his eyes fixed on Ryland, a mixture of hatred and grudging respect twisting his features. "You are destroying 50 years of service, technician. I am saving 3 million lives, Commander," Ryland countered, the vibration making the words shake in his throat. "One flagship is acceptable collateral." Var saw the logic. The logic of mass casualty triage. The logic of institutional survival. He slammed a hand onto the emergency evacuation console. A sharp, mechanical shriek sounded as the primary bridge seal initiated its lockdown protocol for deep space survival. The bridge display, the black panel that had been silent for hours, finally showed something new, something terrifying. A schematic of the secondary reactor core colored a brilliant, unsustainable white, overlaid with the words, "Critical resonance. Systemic destruction. Imminent." The mandate's launch timer stopped abruptly at T0 or 3. The mandate was dead, frozen by the catastrophic core failure it had inadvertently initiated. Ryland collapsed backward, the comm array conduit hissing with residual energy. The harmonic was gone, the pain was absolute, and the ship was dying around them. Kalia didn't look back at the reactor status. She lunged for the 3 active escape pods, the ones Ryland had seen on his small display, and slammed her hand onto the manual launch sequence. Ryland watched, lying prone on the deck, as the 3 emergency escape pods, designed for single occupancy, were ejected with a violent, compressed blast. Kalia was not among them. He forced himself to sit up, staring at Kalia. "You lied. You prepared 3 pods, but you didn't leave." Kalia was staring at the evacuation monitor, her face pale, drawn. "The mandate is gone, Ryland, but the archival faction is still watching. They targeted you, not me. I needed the key, your genetic profile, removed from the blast zone, as living proof that Command was attempting to stop the mandate." She looked at Ryland, then at the empty escape pod bays. "I sent Var and Jensen in 2 of them. Var, the witness, Jensen, the apprentice who knows the mandate structure, the 3rd pod." Kalia paused, her voice shaking with an unmasked vulnerability Ryland had never heard. "Was for you. I calculated the mandate's internal logic. It would pursue the acoustic key before attempting external comms. Your survival was the only way to prove Command wasn't complicit." She wasn't a hero. She was a masterful chess player, sacrificing her queen for a pawn of immense, unexpected value. Ryland didn't move. The Juno 8 was shuddering now with deep, terminal groans. Structural integrity failure was minutes away. "Why didn't you go?" Ryland asked, his voice barely a whisper. Kalia turned, facing the now white, overloaded reactor core schematic. If the flagship is lost, someone must be here to maintain the illusion of protocol. I am the commander. I must log the final failure, Rylan. I must ensure the official record states the mandate was a rogue artifact, not a command declaration. If I leave, the mandate wins the narrative. Rylan understood. Kalia wasn't dying for duty. She was dying to win the historical record, to ensure the systemic lie survived the structural collapse. The primary structural alarm blared, a deep, final bass note that announced imminent, absolute failure. Kalia walked towards Rylan, her uniform now scorched and tattered, her eyes holding the terrifying weight of inevitable death. She knelt, reaching out her good hand to touch his shoulder. "You saved the fleet, NCO Rylan," she said, her voice dropping to a final, intimate level. "You broke the system. You are free now. But freedom comes with a choice, anonymity or responsibility. You can take the last remaining escape pod, the one I reserved for the final protocol officer, and escape. Or you can die here, ensuring my final report is logged without contradiction." Rylan looked past her, toward the final escape pod bay. There was one vessel left, one chance for survival, one path back toward the fringes, away from the inevitable hunt that Kalia had guaranteed. He looked down at his right hand, the blackened wreck still fused with the ruined biometric unit. The pain had subsided to a dull, constant throb, a permanent reminder of his choice. He had paid the price of anonymity. He had accepted the chaos. Rylan didn't answer Kalia. He simply began crawling, dragging his body away from her and toward the last remaining terminal, the hard-wired one she had just used to communicate with the dying ship. He didn't want the escape pod. He wanted the system log. He needed to see what Var and Jensen had logged in their final moments. He needed to know if Kalia's narrative was sound. Rylan reached the terminal and pulled up the outgoing flight path data for the 3 ejected pods. Var and Jensen were clear. He then accessed the primary log of Kalia's personal terminal, the one that had received the original pre-collapse mandate file. Rylan found the final entry Kalia had just logged, her official record of the technical failure and the heroic sacrifice of her crew. But Rylan saw something else, buried 5 lines below the official narrative, an encrypted log only visible to an operator with his level of acoustic access. It was a single coded transmission, time-stamped 3 minutes prior, just before the core resonance. Destination, Pod 77 Alpha, VAR, payload, active mandate key, acoustic profile, Rylan, backup. Kalia hadn't sent Var and Jensen away as witnesses. She had used Var's pod as a lifeboat for Rylan's identity. The mandate wasn't dead. Rylan had simply forced a hard reboot, and Kalia had ensured that the mandate's core component, Rylan's identity, was safely extracted and stored with Commander Var, the most protocol-driven man in the fleet. The key had not been destroyed. It had been redeployed. Rylan looked up at Kalia, who was watching him with a serene, terrifying calm. She hadn't stayed behind to save the narrative. She had stayed behind to ensure Rylan died in the collapse, preventing him from pursuing the true threat. The mandate, carried by Var, ready to restart the purge cycle from a safe distance. The ship groaned, the sound of tearing metal absolute. The deck tilted violently. Rylan did not scream. He did not accuse. He simply accepted the ultimate betrayal. He had won the battle, but he had lost the war, and Kalia had ensured that his sacrifice would fuel the next iteration of the disaster. He slammed his good hand onto the terminal, deleting Kalia's entire final report, and with it, the truth of the mandate's origin. If he was going to die, he would not give her the victory of the narrative. He had won his freedom at the cost of his anonymity, only to find that his identity was still the enemy's most valued asset. The lights on the bridge flashed one final time, a brilliant, violent red, before plunging the flagship into absolute darkness. The structural shriek became a roar. Rylan was alone in the dark, the pain in his hand a silent burning promise of the fight to come. He had 20 minutes to live, and 3 escape pods, one of which carried the mandate, had just been launched into the void. He had achieved the ultimate clarity, purchased at the ultimate price. He was broken, exposed, and utterly doomed, but he knew the truth, and the chase had only just begun. The structural shriek was absolute, tearing the Juno 8 apart layer by layer. Rylan didn't register the sound as noise anymore, but as the raw kinetic signature of impending death. He had deleted Kalia's official narrative, securing her final betrayal, the transfer of his acoustic profile to Var's escape pod, as the last thing he would ever log. Now he had to secure his own exit. He dragged his body, the wreckage of his right hand scraping against the metal deck, toward the final remaining escape pod bay. Kalia remained kneeling beside the overloaded terminal, seemingly observing the terminal collapse, not in defiance, but in grim resignation to the historical wreckage she had fought to control. "You understand," Kalia stated, her voice unnaturally calm over the ambient roar of the failing systems. "I won the narrative. You will be remembered as the anomaly that necessitated the purge. You are the proof." Rylan paused, his chest heaving, ignoring the systemic warning lights that flashed bright red across the tilting deck. He looked at Kalia, not with anger, but with an exhausted pity. "You want a lie, Admiral," Rylan countered, the vibration in the deck amplifying his words. "The narrative needs a witness. Var is carrying the weapon, but I am the only one who knows the mandate's logic. If you survive here, you maintain the system that requires lies. If I survive, I carry the only truth." Rylan reached the final pod's access hatch. It was sealed, waiting for the final protocol officer. He didn't use an override code. He placed his left hand on the manual lock, using his acoustic sensitivity to detect the precise structural frequency of the mechanism, and then, using his ruined right hand, the one that pulsed with the residual electric chaos of the successful resonance, he slammed the wreckage against the emergency sensor plate. The sensor didn't read the input as a command. It read the chaotic energy as a massive power spike, immediately overriding all security safeties and blowing the hatch seal. The final pod's interior light flickered on, sterile and waiting. Kalia watched the brutal efficiency of his exit. "The fleet will hunt you, Rylan. You are the most wanted individual in 1,000 sectors. There is no anonymity left for the key." "I know," Rylan said, pulling himself into the small, confined space of the escape pod. He ignored the safety restraints, falling onto the seat. He reached for the manual launch interface. "You are choosing death," Kalia whispered, her voice tightening as the ship's internal groan became a final tearing sound. "You are choosing to continue the chase alone." Rylan did not look back. He sealed the hatch, and the silence inside the pod was instantaneous and absolute, separating him from the dying flagship. He looked down at the control panel, his reflection visible in the polished metal. A mechanic, level 3, covered in soot, blood, and the final crushing weight of command. He punched the launch sequence. The pod ejected with a violent concussive force that threw Rylan against the restraints he hadn't bothered to secure. Outside the pod viewport, the Juno 8 was no longer a ship. It was a rapidly expanding cloud of white-hot plasma and tearing metal. The focused high-frequency resonance Rylan had initiated had finally reached the secondary reactor core, causing a catastrophic, clean overload that vaporized the flagship, destroying Kalia and the final physical evidence of his acoustic betrayal. Rylan stared at the expanding wreckage, the debris scattering into the blackness. He was alone, isolated, hurtling toward the unmapped outer rim. The silence returned. This time, it wasn't the obscene silence of a locked system, but the cold, vast, absolute silence of the deep void. He spent the next 2 days in the escape pod, not sleeping, but staring at his hands. The right one was a mangled, blackened relic, fused into a claw shape around the broken remnants of the biometric unit. The neurological damage was total. The hand that knew the intimate language of obsolete machinery, that had spent a decade performing the delicate calibration of acoustic dampeners, was now useless. A mechanic who could no longer fix. He activated the pod's internal diagnostic unit, bypassing the sterile report of life support and trajectory, and pulled up the raw neural data transmitted by his damaged hand. The data stream was a constant flux of intense, chaotic electromagnetic noise, the exact chaos harmonic that had defined his life and saved the palace. The pain was permanent. The key was permanent. Rylan refused the internal trauma stims. He needed the pain to remain a constant physical reminder of the price paid. Anonymity was dead. His skill was compromised. His future was exile. But he was free from the necessity of pretending. He pulled up the flight path data of the 3 other pods. Var and Jensen were far ahead, moving towards known command refueling stations. Var, the rigid protocol officer, was now the unsuspecting carrier of the mandate's core component. Rylan knew Var would instinctively try to integrate the mandate key into the system, believing it was a necessary security protocol, not a self-destruct mechanism. Rylan could pursue. He could calculate Var's trajectory, sacrifice the pod's remaining fuel, and attempt an interception. It would be a futile, heroic chase ending in his inevitable capture or death, confirming Kalia's narrative that he was a rogue element. Instead, Rylan set his own course. He altered the navigation input, guiding the pod away from any established shipping lanes, away from any known command sector, toward the farthest reach of the forgotten Zithian expanse, a deep sector known for its lethal radiation storms and total lack of human infrastructure. True exile. He wasn't running from Var. He wasn't running from the mandate. He was running from the expectation of the chase. Kalia and Var had calculated his move based on protocol and principle. Rylan chose neither. He chose survival, not as a hero or a villain, but as a man who recognized the true magnitude of his new reality. He was the living chaos key, and his survival was the only variable that could eventually destabilize Var's clean, rigid, protocol-bound execution of the mandate. The fight would not be won by confrontation, but by his persistence in existing where the system claimed he should not. He sat back in the narrow seat, staring out at the void. The immense, isolating darkness was no longer terrifying. It was honest. Rylan had spent his life trying to flatten his identity, to erase the sound of his unique voice to survive the system. He had failed. His voice had betrayed him, then saved millions, and finally ensured his permanent isolation. But in that isolation, he found a hard, final acceptance. The injustice of his life had been the very thing that made him the only solution. The fight was over. The flagship was gone, the admiral dead, the witness transferred. There was no more to do. There was only the consequence. He opened his left, good hand, letting it rest on the console. It was steady now, tired, but capable. It was the only tool he had left. He thought of the immense ship he had just destroyed, the violent systemic collapse that followed his final acoustic command. He closed his eyes, welcoming the cold, sterile quiet of the escape pod. There was no redemption here, no victory fanfare, only the silence and the permanent knowledge of the price paid. The entire conflict had begun with the subtraction of sound, a sudden, agonizing vacuum. Now he was engulfed by its absolute presence, a total void where noise could not exist. He had spent his life trying to become non-standard. He had succeeded at the cost of everything. The silence, the true unyielding silence, had only just begun. This story is now part of the archive. Subscribe to help preserve future transmissions, and share this episode with someone who still believes in science fiction.